The air was thick, like a suffocating blanket of poison. The smoke of tear gas billowed over the street, settling on the skin, clogging the lungs, turning every breath into flame. Screams, thuds, sirens. The chaos sounded like a symphony of pain and fear. People ran with wet rags over their mouths and noses, their eyes red with tears. Through this storm, amidst torn posters, broken glass, and fallen road signs, a black teenage girl in a wheelchair moved slowly through the storm. Her small fingers gripped the armrests with force, her fingernails digging into the plastic. But it didn't help. The wheels were stuck between the stones of the sidewalk. She wasn't supposed to be here. She just wanted to get home from her doctor's appointment. But the streets of the city had become a battlefield. Somewhere ahead, a flashbang grenade exploded. The white flash blinded her for a second, making her instinctively close her eyes. When she opened them again, a gruesome scene unfolded before her. Two guys in hoodies lying on the pavement, their bodies twitching in convulsions, with three policemen in armor hovering over them. One of them held a gas can in his hand. The other swung a baton, a muffled thump, a muffled groan. The girl yanked the levers on her wheelchair, trying to pull back, but something was in the way. A rock? Shards of glass? Her heart was beating like a frenzy, her palms sweating. She wasn't a protester. She wasn't carrying a placard. She wasn't chanting slogans. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another pop, now on the left. The gas enveloped the air, the poison penetrating her lungs. The girl coughed, tears instantly filling her eyes. But it was impossible to cry. Her mucous membranes burned. Her throat felt like it was tearing from the inside. Footsteps, heavy, thudding, approaching. She looked up. A policeman, tall, powerful, with his face hidden behind a clear plastic shield. There was no doubt in his eyes. "Get back!" he shouted. The girl wanted to say that she couldn't, that her wheelchair was stuck, but instead of words, only a cough came out. The policeman narrowed his eyes. Something predatory and cold flashed in his gaze. It was as if he were not a human being, but a useless object that was interfering with his duty. Her hands gripped the armrests, but there was no escape. The city was choking on smoke, and she was choking with it. She tried to breathe, but the air was soaked with poison. Her throat constricted, her lungs burning like fire. The black teenage girl in the wheelchair coughed, choking on her own breath, but panic was stronger than pain. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. She had to get out of here. Everything was collapsing around them. People were screaming, falling, someone rolling on the asphalt, clutching his gas-burning eyes. An explosion. A blinding flash to the left, a sharp crack, as if the earth itself was being torn apart. The girl flinched and covered her head with her hands. Her body clenched in an instinctive attempt to hide, but there was no shelter. She yanked the handles on the wheelchair, trying to roll backward, but something was in the way. The back wheels were stuck between the sidewalk and the cobblestones of the street. She strained her arm muscles, trying to push herself out, but to no avail. The wheels only scraped on the stones. "Help!" Her voice was weak, ragged, drowned out by sirens, screams, and the crack of exploding grenades. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. Her palms were sweating, her fingers trembling. She tried again to push the wheelchair out of the hole, but her muscles wouldn't listen. Every movement made her shoulders ache, and her eyes blurred with tears. At that moment, someone ran by her side, pushing her wheelchair. She almost tipped over, barely keeping her balance. Her fingers gripped the armrests tightly. She turned her head and met her gaze with a man running, a young guy, about 20 years old, with a bloody face. He looked at her for only a split second and then ran on, leaving her alone. No one stopped. No one offered a hand. She didn't call for help anymore. It was pointless. There was a whistling sound somewhere nearby, followed by a thud. Someone screamed. Another explosion, this time right in front of her. The ground shuddered, pieces of concrete flying apart. The girl cried out and covered her face, but the force of the impact threw her back. The wheelchair tilted, almost toppled sideways, but held steady at the last moment. My ears were ringing. I felt dizzy. Everything was blurry before her eyes, but through the shroud of tears and smoke, she saw a dark figure walking slowly and steadily toward her. Policeman. Big, heavy, with body armor and a clear plastic shield over his face. He was walking straight toward her, holding a gas can in his hands. The girl froze. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And in that moment, the only feeling that came over her was fear. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, if something similar has happened in your life, or if you've witnessed injustice. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. He stopped a few steps away from her. The black teenage girl in the wheelchair looked up. Through the plastic shield of his helmet, all she could see were his eyes. Dark, prickly, cold eyes that held not a shred of doubt, not a shred of humanity. That look was familiar to her. She'd seen it before at the store, where the security guard watched her every move as she picked out a candy bar. On the bus, when the elderly woman clutched her bag tighter as she approached. At school, when the teacher pretended not to notice her classmates whispering behind her back. But that look was different now. Rough, dangerous. She wasn't a person to him. She was a problem, and problems need to be fixed. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, soaked with fatigue and irritation. She opened her mouth, trying to say she was just in the wrong place, but instead of words, only another cough came out. Her throat constricted with gas, her lungs burning. "Say something, God damn it!" He stepped closer. The girl saw his fingers tighten on the gas can. "You're one of them, aren't you? You think the rules aren't for you? You think you can riot and get away with it?" She shook her head, trying to speak, but her breath caught. He hummed. "So I shut up." He looked at her with an expression of disgust. He looked at her with an expression of disgust. And in that moment, she realized. If someone else had been sitting in that wheelchair, white-skinned, well-groomed, dressed in neat clothes, the policeman might have leaned over, asked, "Is everything all right? Do you need help?" But she wasn't that kind of person. She was black, and that was enough. She looked up at him, her shoulders shaking, her hands resting helplessly on the armrests of the wheelchair. She felt small, helpless. He didn't. He relished his power. "Did you think you could be here at the center of it all? Do you really believe that people like you can make a difference?" He leaned closer, hovering over her. "You don't belong in this town." And before she could say anything, his finger pressed the lever of the canister. A scalding stream of gas hit him right in the face. The policeman's voice sounded like a gunshot. "Get back, or I'll use force." A black teenage girl in a wheelchair twitched, instinctively trying to back away, but her wheels wouldn't move. Dirt, debris, scattered rocks, and broken glass made the street a trap. She yanked the levers again, strained her arms, but to no avail. The wheelchair remained motionless. She looked up at the policeman. He waited. There was no compassion in his eyes, only irritation and contempt. His fingers were clutching the gas canister, as if he were just waiting for an excuse to pull the lever. Minus I don't protest. She wheezed, but her voice was drowned in the noise of the crowd, in the shouts, in the sound of sirens. She tried to speak louder. I didn't do anything wrong. The policeman stepped closer. Shut up. I said back off. He knew she couldn't leave. He'd seen it. Saw the way her wheelchair was stuck. Saw her hands shaking with exertion, the fear frozen in her eyes. But he didn't care. Can you hear me? His voice was quieter, but it was threatening. I said back off. She couldn't leave, but he didn't want to hear it. I can't. You can't? He leaned in, bringing his face close to hers. Or maybe you just don't want to. Maybe you like this chaos. Maybe you're one of them. She shook her head, but he didn't even let her answer. I know your type. You think you can do whatever you want and then pretend you're a victim. You think if you're in a wheelchair you can't be touched? You think you're special? His voice was soaked with contempt. She felt something inside her break. She knew she didn't deserve this in any way. She just happened to be here. She didn't carry placards. She didn't shout slogans. She didn't throw bottles at the police. She was just going home. But he didn't see it. To him, she was only one thing, a threat. The policeman took another step forward, looming over her, and the girl reflexively slumped into the back of the wheelchair. I'm not going to say it again. His hand came up. The gas can was right in front of her face. She tried to raise her arms to cover herself, but it was too late. He pulled the lever. A thick jet of gas hit her right in the eye. The policeman did not hesitate. The hand with the canister surged upward, the nozzle freezing a few centimeters from her face. She saw his finger press the lever, saw the first jet of gas sparkle in the dim light of the street lamps, and then it hit her. The noxious mist hit her eyes, her mouth, her nose, penetrating every cell in her body. She flinched, trying to turn away, but it was too late. The burning flared instantly, as if someone had set her skin on fire from the inside. Her eyes flooded with tears, and breathing became torture. She inhaled, and felt something tearing through her lungs. Her chest constricted, and an unbearable pain throbbed in her throat. She coughed, gulping for air, but each new breath brought only more agony. The policeman still had his finger on the lever. He didn't put the can away. He watched as she wriggled in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the gas, turning into searing torrents of pain. She couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. Her body shook in a fit of suffocation. She clutched at her face, trying to wipe away the poison, but it only made the pain worse. Her eyelids burned, her throat felt like sandpaper, and every movement caused a new wave of agony. But that wasn't enough for the policeman. He leaned over, his dark eyes through the plastic shield glowing with cruel satisfaction. That's it. You feel that? Her head jerked back. She wanted to scream at the top of her voice, but she could only let out a wheeze. Did you want to be a part of it? Did you want to play revolution? He smirked. Here it is, your revolution. The gas continued to burn her skin. She could feel the poison seeping in, her lungs clenching, refusing to work. Her body began to weaken. She tried to inhale again, and coughed, making a convulsive, tearing sound like the wheezing of a dying animal. She couldn't even wipe away her tears, couldn't erase the poison. I couldn't move. Shut up and don't move, okay? He hissed. She couldn't answer. He knew it, but it still wasn't enough for him. He pushed her wheelchair. The girl fell backwards, her back hitting the concrete. The world turned upside down. The sky became earth, The noise of the crowd suddenly became muffled, and the pain spilled over her body like poison. She couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She felt her world slowly dissolving into darkness. Her body twitched in agony. A black teenage girl in a wheelchair was choking on her cough, frantically gulping for air, but with each breath, only a new stream of searing pain entered her lungs. The gas was everywhere. It was sticking to her skin, soaking into her clothes, getting into her hair, clogging her throat. She raised her hands, trying to cover her face, but her fingers were weak, useless. All she could do was squirm on the cold pavement, blind, gasping, helpless. She tried to scream, but instead of a scream, there was only a wheeze. Her mouth was open, her lungs desperate for air, but the only thing getting in was the poison. She coughed so hard that her body shuddered in pain, and her chest clenched as if someone was squeezing her with a steel vise. But no one stopped. People around them ran, covering their faces, holding handkerchiefs to their mouths, saving themselves. Some stumbled, some fell, some screamed, but everyone moved on. No one looked back. Her eyes burned, but even through the veil of tears she saw, the world went on. The crowd was rushing forward like a river, and she was just a stone that the river was bypassing. She tried to speak again, but only a new coughing fit escaped her mouth. No one stopped, no one looked, and even those who saw it turned away. The policemen stood a few meters away from her. In black body armor, with batons in their hands, weapons on their belts, they seemed as unshakable as walls. Their faces were covered by helmets, but even without words it was clear that they didn't care. One of them glanced at the girl squirming on the ground and snorted. "One more." The other grinned. "So, have you been playing?" They didn't see her as human. They didn't see her as a child. To them, she was just another one, another problem, another undesirable, another stain to be wiped off the streets. The policeman who had sprayed the gas had already turned away. He wasn't looking at her anymore. She wasn't interesting. He'd done his job. He's already picked his next victim. She tried to raise her hands again, tried again to wipe the poison from her face, but it only made things worse. Pain pierced her skin, her eyes closed with burning, and her breathing became a struggle. She tried calling for help again. She didn't want to die, but her voice was drowned in the hum of the street. Her voice didn't matter. Her pain didn't matter. Her life wasn't important, and it was scarier than anything else. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, if something similar has happened in your life, or if you've witnessed injustice. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. She tried to inhale, but the air wasn't getting through. Her throat constricted in a painful spasm, as if someone were squeezing it from the inside, preventing oxygen from reaching her lungs. Her mouth was wide open, and she gulped frantically for air, but it didn't help. Every breath was dry, empty, desperate. The gas penetrated deeper, destroying her from the inside out. Her body shuddered in agony, her muscles cramped, her hands trembling, gripping the armrests of the wheelchair. She tried to move, tried to struggle, but her strength was failing her. A fog floated in front of my eyes. The noises of the street became muffled, as if someone had covered their ears with absorbent cotton. The screams of people, the crack of grenades, the noise of sirens, everything became distant, non-existent. But fear was closer than ever. She realized it suddenly. She could die, right there, on the cold, dirty asphalt, among the flying shards of glass under the heavy boots of fleeing people. She could die. and no one's gonna stop. No one's gonna help. No one will even remember her name. Panic came over her like a wave of ice. She jerked, trying to do something, anything, but her body wouldn't listen. The wheelchair, her only way to move through the world, was now a cage. The wheels were stuck, and no matter how much she pulled, no matter how hard she tried to push, she couldn't get out. She started to twitch, tearing her nails against the plastic armrests, but it was no use. She was trapped. The cops didn't even look in her direction. They continued onward, knocking down protesters, throwing them face down in the dirt, twisting their arms. To them, she was no longer existing. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't human. She was just unnecessary. The policeman who had sprayed the gas didn't even look back. His voice came from somewhere in the distance. "Moving on. Leave her alone." Those words stuck in her head, echoing in the heated chaos of her mind. Leave it. Because she's not important. Because people like her don't mean anything. Because black skin is a judgment call. Her body no longer obeyed her. Her head was spinning. Her eyes were swimming. The darkness was slowly consuming her consciousness. The world around me was getting farther away. The last thing she saw was someone's feet running past. And then she realized that to this world she was invisible. It hung in the air. That's what it seemed to her. Her body was here, in the wheelchair, on the cold pavement, but her consciousness drifted somewhere in the void. The dizziness was followed by sharp flashes of pain, as if her lungs were being squeezed by hot fingers. She couldn't move. I couldn't talk. Even breathing had become something unnatural. Each breath was like a gulp of the water she was drowning in. Only a cough snapped her out of this stupor, making her shudder with every convulsive attempt to breathe in air soaked with gas and burning rubber. She felt consciousness slipping away. But at that moment, her wheelchair was shoved sharply to the side. Her body jerked back, her head jerked back, and her arms slipped helplessly from the armrests. The world around her floated, the sounds muffled, as if she were underwater. Someone tossed her aside like garbage. Her wheelchair turned, wheels squeaking on the wet sidewalk, and she felt her side hit the sidewalk. The pain echoed in her shoulder, but she didn't even cry out. She couldn't. "Stay out of the way, damn," someone muttered, but she couldn't make out the last words. Someone else kicked her wheelchair, not hard, more like an annoyed gesture, the way one pushes a useless box out of the way. She didn't see any faces. She saw only silhouettes blurring in the smoke, moving, running away, fighting. Police officers continued the sweep. The policeman who had sprayed gas in her face didn't even look at her anymore. He's already picked a new target. There was a man standing in front of him, tall, thin, with dreadlocks that were disheveled. He was wearing a t-shirt with a blurry print and holding a tattered poster. The girl watched as the policeman raised the canister and felt something squeeze inside. It will happen again. Over and over again. She was already gone. She wasn't important. The policeman didn't even look in her direction. To him, she was a finished job. She's not a person. She's a statistic. She's just more proof that people like her don't mean anything. Everything around it was blending into one gray blur. Noise, loud voices, grenade explosions, sirens, but it all seemed distant now. She could feel her body losing the last of its strength as her eyelids grew heavier and heavier. There was no justice in this place. Here, there were only those who could beat and those who must endure. She was among the second. She closed her eyes. Because it didn't matter now. Time has stopped. A black teenage girl in a wheelchair lay on the sidewalk, her body dangling limply like a broken doll. the wheels of the wheelchair spinning slowly with the occasional jolt. The fumes of tear gas settled on her skin, clogging her pores, making pain a constant backdrop to her existence. She couldn't move. I couldn't talk. She couldn't even open her eyes. Her eyelids were burning. Her eyelashes were slick with tears. Saliva ran down her chin, and even her breathing sounded like a muffled, ragged wheeze. But no one stopped. The minutes stretched on like infinity. People ran, jumped over her, tripped over her wheelchair, but they didn't linger. Someone looked at her for a moment, but immediately turned away, pretended not to see her, like she was part of the street, like she was something inanimate. She heard someone screaming nearby. A gunshot slammed again. Someone ran so close that the rush of air from his movement ruffled her hair. But no one saw her. She felt the weight of despair squeezing her chest even harder than the gas. She was dying here, on the sidewalk, among pieces of broken glass, cigarette butts, and plastic bottles, and no one cared. It was maybe a minute, maybe 5. She didn't know. Suddenly, something touched her face. Cold water. A sharp stream rushed over her burning eyes, flooding her eyelids, running down her cheeks. She twitched. Her breathing was still ragged, but she tried to open her eyes, seeing the blurred silhouette through the shroud of tears. "Hey, girl, can you hear me?" Voice. A man's. Rough, but not angry. She felt strong hands gently lift her head, drops of water spilling over her face again. Breathe. Breathe deep. Breathe in through your nose. Come on. She couldn't. Every breath was torture, but he kept talking, his voice breaking through the hum of pain and fear. "Are you okay? Say something." She opened her mouth, but couldn't utter a word. Only another coughing fit. "Shit." The man cursed, but not irritated, more concerned. He splashed water on her face again. Cold drops penetrated his mouth, on his tongue, washing away the acrid tang of the gas. She breathed a little deeper. She tried to lift her arm, but her muscles were exhausted, her fingers trembling like a broken marionette. The man exhaled heavily. Jesus. Why didn't anyone stop? Why did they just leave you here? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because I knew the answer. Because it wasn't an accident. Because she was invisible. She turned her head slowly, glancing outside. People continued to walk by. Police officers were still breaking up the protest. None of them even looked in her direction. She was nothing again. A problem that someone just pushed out of the way. And the worst part wasn't the burning in my eyes. Not the gas that was still eating away at her lungs. And the fact that no one cared about her pain. She didn't remember how she ended up at home. She didn't remember how the man who tried to help her brought her to her senses. How someone else helped her out of the chaos. How her wheelchair, dirty, flooded with water and gas residue, swung into the cab. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten to my apartment, how I'd opened the door with trembling hands, how I'd closed myself in the bathroom, trying to wash off what had embedded itself deeper than just a chemical burn. She remembered only one thing. She lay on the ground, panting, and no one stopped. The video appeared online the very next day. Blurry phone footage showed a police officer spraying gas in the face of a black teenage girl in a wheelchair. She twitches, choking on her cough, falls sideways, and someone kicks her wheelchair, tossing it aside like a bag of garbage. The video exploded on social media. Hashtags, calls for justice, outraged comments, thousands of reposts. People wrote about police brutality, about racism, about how it must stop. How is this possible in today's world? This officer must be punished. She was a child. She didn't even protest. The anger spread like wildfire. But the girl knew what was coming next. She'd seen it before. Loud words, news headlines, TV anchors discussing another egregious case. Politicians declaring that the situation needs to be addressed. People taken to the streets with placards, and then silence. The video will stop being a hot topic after a week. In a month, he'll be forgotten. A year from now, no one will remember her name. She sat in her room, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her body still ached. The chemical burns on her skin itched. Her lungs struggled to take in air. But the worst of it was inside. She felt like she didn't belong in this world, that her existence is nothing more than a mistake that can be ignored, that she's nothing. She closed her eyes. Flash again. A cop pointing a gas can at her. The voice again. Shut up and don't move. Pain again. She opened her eyes abruptly, clenching her fingers into a fist. Tears were rolling down her cheeks, but she wasn't wiping them away now. She knew this day had changed her. She knew these moments would stay with her forever. But she also knew one more thing. No one will be held accountable for that. The city will continue to live its life. The cop who gassed her won't lose his job. He will continue to patrol the streets, kick those he considers unnecessary, and consider himself above the law. And one day it will all happen again, somewhere else, with another person, with someone who also happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She inhaled, gritting her teeth. She wanted to scream, wanted to smash something, wanted to vent the pain that was eating away at her from the inside out. But she didn't do anything. She just sat there, lonely, broken, invisible. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Subscribe, and like us to support us, and don't miss new stories. May your day be peaceful and fair. If you listen to the end, write in the comments, "The invisible should not be silent."